Shalom. This is Rabbi Schutz from Jacksonville, Florida. I come from a large family in Buffalo, New York, and I'm not a first-generation believer. In fact, my father was a guest speaker at several congregations in Western New York over the years, so I heard much of the Bible as a child. In fact, I remember praying to accept Yeshua at a very early age after a very fiery message, and I tried my best to live right. But like we all do, I noticed the hypocrisy and a great deal of irreverence among the people claiming to be believers, and that tested me, like so many other things did in my childhood. I was the seventh child and the runt of the litter. In fact, my family loved to play some old song called The Runt, and they associated it with me. We were not homeless, but we struggled to keep warm, even in the house. So I remember huddling next to the floor vents in order to keep warm in the winter. It didn't seem like there was ever much food in the house either. Moreover, I remember seeing my siblings beaten, and more than one of them running away, and at least one of them being kicked out. And I remember wishing I was bigger and could do something to help them. I also remember getting in a lot of fights as a small red-headed child with a big nose, always under attack for no reason, always needing to defend myself, until I learned to keep a low profile. Even then, things were tough. Once on the bus, the other children, unprovoked, began spitting on me and laughing, and they continued doing so the whole trip home until I was covered with slime. I was traumatized, and I never rode that bus again. I started to walk to school and walk home. I know very well what it's like to be bullied. I know what it's like to be different. I know what it's like to live as an underdog. I know what it's like to be oppressed. My parents divorced while I was still in my early teens, and given my situation at school, that facilitated my fall into drugs, alcohol, and so-called freedom for several years. I didn't see any future, at least not anything good for myself, so why bother with school? I would skip classes, even whole days, regularly, and no one seemed to care. Soon I moved in with my father and made new friends, who were all in the wrong crowd, and partying became the focus of my existence. Even in that cesspool, though, something began drawing me back. I knew my friends and family were lost, and even from my own condition, I wanted to help them. Despite my condition, I knew a good deal of truth, and I thought that I could help them. Bible verses or ideas began to flow out of me in conversations or even at parties. It wasn't like I was literally trying to save anyone, or as if I thought I was on the right road. It was more of a sharing from my own search for real truth and what life was really about. Sometimes people like to talk about that, and more often in that crowd it was shut down as a buzzkill. That life promised acceptance, but it only delivered emptiness. In time, I started to turn around. I joined the Navy, where I learned or relearned discipline and cleaned up my lifestyle for a while. When off duty, I still drank quite a bit, and it even began to affect my job. When I realized that, though, I took control and reined myself in. I still drank, but rarely lost control. Soon I found a wife and learned real responsibility. I wasn't living for myself anymore. I had to do well to support her. I found a meaning in that and began experiencing great successes, earning many rewards, advancing quickly in rank. Many struggle for years or never even make it, but I made chief in my first year of eligibility, for example. At this point, my faith journey began in earnest, slowly at first. My wife is a Catholic Jew, so occasionally I would go with her to make her happy. Happy wife, happy life, right? Once at a base in Chicago, our neighbors came over to talk with us about God. They were Baptists and convinced us to be immersed, so we were. But changes in our lifestyles was slow in coming. At another base, we began attending an Assembly of God church and learned a lot about the Ruach. We began to dive in much deeper with our own studies and worship, and soon I was teaching We were noticing that something wasn't quite right. We would run into scriptures that conflicted with the teachings we had heard on issues like Shabbat, and the answers didn't make sense. It was as if God was hearing our hearts, because soon we were visited by Murray Tillis from Light of Messiah Ministries in Atlanta, who showed us the Messiah and the Passover. No one had ever presented Yeshua in a Jewish context to us before, and it was like a veil was being ripped away. We started attending his monthly Bible study, and soon we discovered Sid Roth's radio show and came into contact with Paul Wilbur's Messianic music. And soon we were immersing ourselves in Messianic material. Books by Dan Gruber, for example. And we knew this was the way. The Ruach was leading us. And soon we were attending Beth Hallel before I transferred to Washington, D.C., where we settled into Ahavat Yeshua, learned Hebrew, and even learned to dance. We began embracing our heritage, celebrating the Moadim of Adonai. And before long, I was teaching Hebrew. We began to follow the Torah in earnest. We were blessed with great leaders who stressed the difference between scriptures and traditions, and who loved God and provided great examples. We were growing in knowledge, understanding, and wisdom as our sanctification had shifted into high gear. All my energy, which had previously been directed into my military career, was now diverted into my spiritual development. Very little, if anything, was devoted to retirement. I took a few classes here and there, but not much. So I did retire from the Navy, and I moved down to Florida, and I had difficulty finding employment. So first I went into security and began moving up quickly until a friend who worked in human services at a new company in town was able to get me an interview with them, and soon I was working in accounting. Again, I excelled and began moving up until the housing bubble burst, because the company was dealt with housing. The housing bubble burst in 2008, 2009, and the local branch of the company went out of business, leaving me with a big question mark for the future again. During those days in accounting, I was at Beth Israel as both a teacher and a cantor. For a short time, leading a small group as well. That was for several years, all those things, teacher and cantor. Unfortunately, my mother died during that time as well up in Buffalo, and due to work constraints, I wasn't able to get there before she went into the coma from which she would not return. But one of my sisters relayed to me that my mother could see my future very clearly. She'd asked her what she thought about this child and that child, and my mother went on and on about some of them. But when my sister asked about me, she said my mother had only one word: teacher. This remained in the back of my mind as I pondered my future and weighed my options. When I was in the service, I didn't have any GI Bill. I came in during what was called the VEEP era. It was a program that replaced the GI Bill for a short time, and it was nowhere near as good. Later, a new GI Bill was introduced, but you had to have money in VEEP in order to switch over to it, and I didn't. Thus, when I retired, I had no educational benefits. Nevertheless, when that housing bubble burst, eventually something made me check with the VA. And amazingly, I discovered that Congress had passed a new GI Bill for veterans of 9/11. Adonai had miraculously provided me a way to gain a higher education. They would pay 90% of my tuition and books and provide me a living stipend as well. They paid me to go to school for up to 3 years. Baruch Hashem. Therefore, I focused all my energy on getting as much as I could in that time frame. School became my full-time job. I began working towards an associate degree at Florida State College, not really knowing what to do with it, but eventually I relied on some advice I'd heard before retiring from the Navy. For your second career, think, if I could do anything, what would I do? In other words, do what you really want this time. I wasn't sure what that was, though. But I did know what genre of scholastic material most appealed to me: history and religion. So after I graduated from FSCJ with high honors, I enrolled, still under the GI Bill, at UNF, the University of North Florida, as a history major with a religion minor. My courses included gems like ancient Rome, ancient Greece, modern Germany, the Crusades, medieval heresies, history of the Middle East, the problem of evil, and the just war, just for an example. All of this and more would prove to be an outstanding preparation for ministry and sermons, by the way. About that, I have to say that I had felt a calling on my life for many years, and many others had seen it bubbling out of me too, but I was afraid to pursue it. I felt totally ignorant regarding how that should be done and felt totally unprepared for it, so I kept it to myself and kept pushing it really to the back burner. As I was completing my bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, but still unemployed, I came to another crossroads. Amazingly, I still had some of that GI Bill remaining, and I didn't want to waste it. I could stay on the history track, aiming to write and teach history, but that felt like a miserable life to me. I could make more money and go back into accounting, but that was also miserable. Or I could finally take the biggest leap of my life, other than accepting Messiah and getting married, and pursue ministry. On the same day I graduated from UNF, my wife and I left for Israel. I had the most magnificent time of our lives. The Bible came more alive to us than it had ever been. We didn't go with any tour group. We experienced the buses and trains and taxis and the people. We met soldiers and families and even a millionaire. We didn't know was a millionaire at the time. And we felt like we were home. That Aliyah had been nice, but we had to come back. When we did, I began to check on schools where I might learn biblical Hebrew. I had done this before, but couldn't find anything locally. Now, however, I remembered a very liberal religion professor who had bought me lunch one day, actually I think it was breakfast, and said that he sensed my calling and recommended Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, a local conservative evangelical school. At the time I thought it was an odd recommendation coming from him, but hey, God can speak through a donkey, so maybe he could speak to a conservative through a liberal too. When I looked into that school, I learned some things that were very important. I learned some things that were very important in helping me make my decision. One, this is one of the best seminaries in the nation, accredited by the same organization as Harvard. Two, they have a good-sized school, but the Jacksonville campus is small, so students get all the attention they need. Three, one of the founders is Billy Graham. Four, it's an interdenominational school, which accepts Messianic Jews, so there would be no paper tigers in any of the theological discussions. And five, the biggest strength of their curriculum is biblical languages. I was sold. This master's program would be a huge commitment. It was a 4-year program, and my GI Bill only had 3 months remaining, so most of this would come out of my pocket. Moreover, that was a Christian institution, and I'm Messianic, so I felt this would not prepare me fully for ministry in the Messianic world. While I was considering this, I had a vision where I was strolling on the Sea of Galilee. I knew what it looked like now, and I didn't have a care in the world. I didn't understand it at first, this vision. Obviously, I'm not capable of such things. But I came to understand that it was as if God was saying, walk with me, and I will hold you up, and I will take care of everything. So I simultaneously entered the International Alliance of Messianic Congregations and Synagogues, the IAMCS yeshiva. Again, this would cost me. This was a huge step of faith, all coming from my pocket. Looking back, I can't fathom how much faith my wife has in me to sit quietly by and watch me pour our savings into these schools with no solid job waiting at the other end. Shortly after I had already paid for all my coursework at IAMCS, I received a call from a woman who had once been in one of my Bible studies. I hadn't seen her in a long time, so it was a little odd. As a matter of fact, she stated that it might be odd, but she wanted to know how much the yeshiva cost me. I told her, and she gasped. God had told her to send me exactly that amount of money, and she didn't know why or what it was for. I was floored. Now and then in life we need confirmation, and sometimes we get it in the most amazing ways. Meanwhile, at Gordon Conwell in a spiritual dynamics class, I was able to map out the story of my life like a script, like the script of a movie. And I couldn't help but notice what I would call a guardian pattern. I played goalie as a child. I was always a stickler about biblical truth to friends and family. I served in the Navy for 20 years guarding the nation. I came out and worked in security where I protected other people's property, and then in accounting where I guarded other people's finances, and I defended the truth in numerous debates with much success, even in religious classes at the secular university. Looking back, I can't help but think that's the role of a shepherd, to defend the flock. Teacher was another major trend, with Bible studies, Hebrew classes, Navy classes, and providing personal guidance to others on numerous occasions, as a chief and as a believer. Amazingly, this is the role of a rabbi. A rabbi is not a priest who mediates between God and man. Rather, a rabbi, or didaskalos in Greek, is a teacher. This was what my mother had said, or prophesied about me. Learning biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek has enhanced this gift immensely, confirming Gordon Conwell is a right choice for much of my studies. I graduated valedictorian with my master's in divinity degree, but believe me, it was not without serious challenges. Perhaps the biggest challenge came when my wife somehow managed to contract Rocky Mountain spotted fever when I was at a critical point in my Greek studies. Living in Jacksonville, it was difficult for this to be diagnosed properly, and I almost lost her because of it. I don't mean that as a disparaging remark against the medical people here. It's just that Rocky Mountain spotted fever is rather unexpected in Jacksonville, Florida. I still remember her shaking violently under mounds of blankets while racked with raging waves of high fever, unable to eat anything, with a rash covering most of her body. It was a battle to get her proper diagnosis and proper care, and her recovery took several weeks. I remember sitting at her bedside, studying quietly through the night beside a tiny lamp, and we soldiered on. It turns out, by the way, that she was patient zero in a minor outbreak of Rocky Mountain spotted fever here. Because of her, doctors were much better prepared for the others who followed. My studies were important to me. A good rabbi or pastor must know the Word of God and know it well. For me, this is not optional. When I completed my MDiv, I seriously considered applying for a doctorate program, and my dean at Gordon Conwell assured me that I would have no problems with funding. He had graduated from Cambridge and still had connections. I even began making my own connections and considering what I might specialize in, and then it was not to be, at least not yet. It felt like I was being blocked somehow, but not by anyone on the outside, not externally. One day on the phone with David Rudolph, the head of the Messianic Studies program at King's University in Dallas, he suggested that the community was in bad need of rabbis and maybe pursuing a doctorate could wait. It was not my hope or my plan, but apparently it was God's plan. While I was considering these things, I needed some income, so I started tutoring Hebrew at Gordon Conwell as a teacher's aide and substitute teaching at Christ Church Academy, where on my first day I met a Spanish teacher who asked me about myself, and there was an instant connection. Soon I was teaching Hebrew to her and several others in our home, followed by in-depth Bible studies. This in turn led to the development of a Chavurah, and after much prayer to the creation of Kehillat Elohim, our Messianic congregation. We struggled to find an umbrella organization with solid theology under which we could flourish until we found the United Messianic Jewish Assembly. Here we can practice the Torah. Here we can share the deeper things of God. Here we acknowledge that one is saved by the grace of Hashem through a real faith, emunah, the kind of faith that produces action, as seen in the works which He has prepared beforehand for us to do. Here we can worship as Jews and Gentiles together as one, without prejudice or preference. Here there's no allergic reaction to Jewish terminology, defining sin as that which breaks the Torah, for example. Here we are at home. My experiences and studies have taught me that Adonai is interested in freeing us from more than the consequences of sin. He wants us to be free from sin itself. He wants us to grow in purity and holiness. He wants us all to follow His ways, the Torah, as both Yeshua and Shaul did. Rabbi Cassidy told me once that I'm a shaliach, but I'm just a shaliach after the manner of the pizza guy. I'm just a guy delivering the truth. I'm just a weak little vessel, a runt, allowing myself to be used for His glory, teaching those from all nations to obey His commands, guarding the truth, and protecting those under my care. And that's how it should be. I'm fulfilling my call, and that's all that matters. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Yeshua. Shalom.